Hey everyone, welcome to the D. Louise book series. I'm Christina Christina. This is where we read books and talk about books. No special effects, no special editing, none of that stuff going on here. And I would ask you please to check out my Star Trek Next Generation recaps on Fridays. Also, my if then videos. If you like this author, then maybe you like that author. We started out with the Bridgertons. If you like Julia Quinn's Bridgertons, then maybe you like Catherine Coulter's Sherbrooke, Stephanie Lawrence Sinsters, Joanna Lindsay's Mallory's. Then I did some homicides. Then I did forensics. We did witches. We did vampires. We did werewolves. Um, I did a time one at time travel, and I even got a book to read off of my own recommendations. I am enjoying the heck out of the Time series. Please see those Julia uh, McQuinn videos, and please also check out we're also doing Alex Cross, uh, James Patterson's Alex Cross series. We are doing J.R. Ward's Black Dagger Brotherhood series. And we are doing Victoria Thompson's Gaslight series. And I would also ask you to check out Flashback Monday, where I review at least 50 to 60 books, sometimes more. I've done some videos this week that YouTube has shown to nobody. So if you all could go out and check some of those out, I'd really appreciate it. Uh, some of the Alex Cross ones haven't gotten very few views. Um, I work really hard on these. I spend all this time reading the books, taking notes. Uh, it hurts sometimes when YouTube just doesn't. I mean, that's what I totally. Because some of my average video gets 5 to 10 views. That's not a lot, but that's my average. So when one of my videos only gets 3 views, and I know it's just us, that means the public hasn't seen it at all. Maybe my thumbnail is wrong. But if you're following the series, if you're reading this series along with me, you should recognize the title, right? And my face, right? Sorry. So, we are almost to the end of this series, and then we will have to wait till next year for the next one. Woe is me. But I love this series. I will warn you right now, lots and lots and lots and lots of spoilers. I do not spoil the whodunit, but I spoil the characters like crazy. Um, we started off with, if you've watched all the videos, Sarah Brandt was a midwife when Frank Malloy met her. He was a detective with the police department when he met her. The characters have since progressed. It took 17 books, but they finally got married. They have adopted Frank's son, who is deaf. And they're all learning sign language. So we all have to learn sign language slowly, like I'm doing, microscopically slowly. And if you also noticed, J.R. Ward's Black Dagger Brotherhood, John Matthew, while he can hear, he is unable to speak because he has Darius's voice, so he also lives on sign language. So we have a couple of characters who live on sign language. Live. I think that's live. Live. Some of these signs I remember from years ago. But, so Sarah and Frank, they finally got together. They all have a lovely relationship with Sarah's parents now, which was estranged at the beginning of the series. Mr. and Mrs. Decker love the two kids that Sarah and Frank adopted Catherine, and then Sarah adopted Brian. So now they have 2 kids legally. And then, of course, there's Maeve, um, the one that was taking care of Catherine while Sarah was uh, out birthing children. But now she's going to start helping with the detective agency. She's been helpful in the past. And because the kids have gone to school now. And Mrs. Ellsworth, our lovely neighbor who has been through this with thick and thin in every book. I enjoy sharing her sayings with you. And shall we get started? Now, in this book, Nelson, we've only seen him a couple times. One book was totally based with him when he was accused of embezzling, which he did not do, and Sarah and Frank proved, embezzling and murder, which Sarah and Frank worked to prove that he did not do. It was one of the earlier books. So we got to meet Nelson on a one-on-one basis, but we've known his mom since book 1. And now Nelson has married Theta, and we got to meet Theta's family. And in this book, they're all getting killed off in Theta's family. Oh, wait a second. I've got to blow my nose. Yes, ma'am. Yes. And as you know, I like to share my books with you. Uh, we start the book off with a little socialization. Mrs. Ellsworth comes over to invite the Mallorys to dinner with her new in-laws. Clarence Pritchard owns a dairy, and according to Mrs. Ellsworth, that's all he talks about is his dairy. And Theta is now Nelson's new wife, and the Mallorys have moved up in the world. They have bought an automobile. Then Mrs. Ellsworth said, I don't suppose Mr. Malloy would be willing to do our first step this New Year's. You mean to be the first man to step over your threshold after midnight to bring you luck. Mrs. Ellsworth was notoriously suspicious. Doesn't Nelson usually do it? Yes, but I thought it would be fun to have someone else do it this time. We just need a dark-haired man to come in with a lump of coal and a few coins right after midnight to ensure a prosperous 1900. The series has advanced into the 1900s. I'm sure Malloy would love to do it, Sarah lied easily, picturing how he'd roll his eyes if asked to participate in one of Mrs. Ellsworth's suspicions. We'll be going down to the Trinity Church to hear the bells ring in the new year, and I'm not sure when we'll get back. Mrs. Ellsworth brightened at that. I suppose you'll be driving down in your new motor car. Yes, Gino will drive it. Of course, he's got it running perfectly. I understand it's quite a challenge. Malloy's partner had taken quite an active interest in the motor car and its workings, and which was fortunate because Malloy had no interest in all. So we have a car. Now, there's also another discussion. Now, I know it was discussed here. I lived through this discussion that reflects how old I am. But this discussion arose when 1999 rolled into 2000. And the people explained and proclaimed that the century really starts in 2001 because you don't start a year in year 0. You don't call a year 0. You call it year 1. So 0 doesn't count. And Mr. Pritchard was having a huge uh issue with that. He was handing out flyers and trying to get people to recognize year zero. They have a church service and play a few songs on the bells. They've got quite a set of them there. As I'm sure you know, ring out the old and ring in the new, as they say. Nothing special, nothing to acknowledge the new century, Pritchard demanded. Oh dear, Mrs. Pritchard murmured. I believe we're celebrating the start of the 20th century next year, Malloy said, a little puzzled. At least that's what I read in the newspapers. Newspapers, bah, what do they know? Yes, what do they know? Thea agreed too quickly and too cheerfully. Mother Ellsworth had made the most scrumptious apple tart for dessert. I can't think why it's taking so long to bring it in. Can you imagine saying the 20th century doesn't start with the year 1900, Pritchard said. Our years have started with 18 for the entire 19th century. Any fool can see that when it changes to 19, it's the start of a new century. That's reasonable, Thea said with desperate glance at Nelson. Yes, it is. But time didn't start with the year zero, Maeve said. Everyone turned to her in surprise, especially Mr. Pritchard. Well, it didn't. Time must have started with year one. What does that have anything to do with it? Gino asked. If the first year was one and the century is 100 years, the century ends at the end of year 100, not at year 99. She's got a point. She's got a point. Which was the argument Sarah had been reading about in the newspapers for months as the end of 1899 approached. Very logical, young lady, Pritchard said scornfully, but there's no logic when time began. The Georgian calendar which we use today and by which we determine that year of our Lord 1899 didn't come into use until 1582, not year one. There was never a year one, not even with the Julian calendar, which came into use in our year 46. Before that, the Romans didn't measure time by our calendars or even recognize the concept of BC, so to them it was the year 708, Urbi Condita, which is a year numbering system used by the ancient Roman historians, although it was never actually used by the Romans themselves, who didn't number their years at all but referred to them by the names of the rulers in power at their time. So there was never a year one. Interesting. So then Harvey and his so we go back and explain that we have Nelson is Mrs. Ellsworth's son. He married Theta. And then we've got Mr. and Mrs. Pritchard and Harvey, their Theta's brother, and their son. And the father and son have a disagreement. I'm trying to figure out why I wanted this page. Oh, it's just about the motor car. I just wanted to read. You are so cute. Yes, you are. Yes, you are, Missy. So they're in the motor car. Fortunately, the streets were still crowded at this late hour as people roamed around, waiting for the stroke of midnight that would keep the beginning of the new year, and the crowds kept Gino from going much faster than 5 miles an hour. The motor car could go up to 20 miles per hour, or so Gino informed him. Frank couldn't imagine why anyone would need to go faster. What would Frank do in today's cars? Good Lord. 5 miles per hour was enough to rip your eyeballs right out of your head, which was why they all had to wear goggles in addition to the cotton dusters that protected their clothes from the dust and dirt of the streets. Someone should really come up with a way to protect them from the wind at least. Get a horse, some hollered from the safety of the sidewalk. Frank glared at him, but Sarah and Maeve waved gaily. Sarah seemed to be enjoying herself, even if her elaborate hat kept threatening to blow off, and Maeve was possibly thrilled. If Frank could only see today's cars, enclosed, heating and air conditioning. So they go to the church, and they go to the celebration for New Year's, and they see Mr. Pritchard, Clarence Pritchard. He's handing out his pamphlets. He's trying to get people to recognize 1900 as the year one. And he doesn't look very well. And they try to invite him into the car to join the fireworks with them. He refuses, and he goes on trying to encourage people. And that's how we kind of end the evening. The next day, Mrs. Ellsworth comes to them and informs them that Mr. Pritchard was murdered. So the Malloys go over to the Pritchard house and they talk to Mrs. Pritchard. And she's not too forthcoming on information. But then Harvey returns. He had been to the morgue. He had to identify the body. And they say that the police said that his father was not robbed when he was strangled, but all of his belongings are missing, which leads to, wink wink, the cops taking his belongings. During this time frame, cops weren't really paid that much. They probably aren't paid that much today either. But we have a little more, I think we have a little more honesty today. That they don't steal, which is watches and jewelry and stuff for victims. All this forensic stuff's now. But so they have to tell the cops that there'll be a reward for the return of the merchandise, no questions asked, and somehow the merchandise gets returned a little later. So Sergeant O'Connor, we know from previous books, he doesn't really like Malloy that much. Look. I just thought I'd show you what I was looking at. Your trip. Yes, you're cute. Yes, you are. Um, so Sergeant O'Connor arrives. He's been chosen to investigate the crime. Let's see. O'Connor was supposed to wait in the hallway until Hattie told him whether or not Mr. Malloy would see him, but he hadn't waited. He almost instantly appeared behind Hattie and slipped by her, stepping into the parlor with a brashness that annoyed Frank almost as much as impressed him. Frank and Gino rose to greet him. O'Connor was a big man and still young. He hadn't been a detective very long, but long enough to have crossed Frank. He apparently hadn't yet recovered. "Happy New Year, O'Connor," Frank said with far less enthusiasm than he greeted Gino. "Same to you." O'Connor was busy looking around, taking in the furnishings and the paintings. Things Frank and Sarah had bought in Europe on their wedding trip. Frank could see he was impressed and trying not to show it. "What brings you here?" Frank asked. "The Pritchard murder." His inspection of the room had noted the pile of newspapers, and he raised his eyebrows. "I went to see the family this morning, and they mentioned you'd seen Pritchard at the church last night. Ordinarily, I wouldn't have bothered tracking down a witness like that, but I couldn't pass up the chance to see how a millionaire lives." But Frank and Sarah deliberately chose to live moderately compared to most of the wealthy families in the city. "I hope you're not too disappointed Not a bit. Nice house, nice things, nice wife, all bought and paid for. Frank had actually taken a step toward O'Connor, ready to throw him bodily out of the house, but Sarah caught his hand and stopped him. "Won't you sit down, Mr. O'Connor?" she said in a voice he seldom heard her use. It was the voice she learned at her mother's knee, her lady of the house voice. Um, do you have a wife, Mr. O'Connor?" she asked. Yes, I do. "And exactly how much do you pay her?" So he questions them on seeing the victim. And, you know, are you having fun with my books? Are you having fun, Missy? 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 Stop. Shouldn't. That's my good marker. Um, so they, the murder has made headlines. And if you've been following my videos before, you know I always share parts of the book. So they've got the newspapers out. Sarah took the newspaper and sat down in the nearest chair to read it. It was the evening edition of The World. This story was much longer than those from the morning, and it was on the front page. The headline read, "Dairy owner murdered on church property," and beneath it in smaller letters, "New century hearsay brings death." The story was accompanied by a picture of Mr. Pritchard. The newspapers couldn't print photographs, so they made engravings of the actual pictures, which meant the result wasn't particularly clear or detailed, but it's still Mr. Pritchard all right. So, uh, the then, uh, Theta says that she would like to hire, Frank and Gino to look into the murder. And she knows what they did for Nelson. So they go down to the police station to talk to O'Connor, maybe to offer assistance on how the murder is going. And O'Connor tells them, the sergeant looked down his bull nose at them. "Malloy, is it? What in God's name are you doing here?" "I came to see Detective Sergeant O'Connor. Is he in?" "That he is," the sergeant reported with a smirk. "He's probably upstairs licking his wounds." His wounds? Frank didn't think they were actual wounds, but poor Nelson was looking a little pale. "Yeah, the chief had to take him in hand this morning. Poor fellow won't be eating solid food for a while, I'm guessing." "He's upstairs, you say?" The sergeant nodded. "Be gentle with him, will you? He's just a boy." Frank grinned and motioned for Nelson to accompany him. "What did he mean? What happened to O'Connor?" Nelson whispered as they climbed the stairs to the second floor. "Not what you're probably imagining," Frank said. "Chief Jeffrey just called him on the carpet for something. Not to do with Pritchard's case, surely. I doubt it. Pritchard's death could hardly be important enough for Bill DeVry to concern himself." DeVry had been the chief of police for a little over a year. After a notorious career that ended with him being convicted of bribery and extortion, of which he was more than guilty. When his sentence was overturned on appeal, he'd been reinstated on the force and promoted twice before being named chief of police. Apparently criminals can rise in the world. Bribery and extortion. Before being named chief of police in an effort by the politicians to undo all the reforms Theodore Roosevelt had made during his tenure as police commissioner. DeVry was making a good job of it too. They found O'Connor at his desk in the detective's room. Only two of the detectives were at their desks, and they were studiously ignoring their visitors. O'Connor had been staring glumly into space until he heard their approach. "You started this." "Started what?" Frank asked, pulling over a couple of chairs so he and Nelson could be comfortable. "You're the one set the chief on me." "Why would I do that? And the chief isn't likely to listen to me anyway." O'Connor glanced at Nelson and frowned. What are you doing here? You came to gloat? No. Nelson said in surprise. I came to offer a reward. A reward for what? O'Connor growled, angry now. For finding who killed Clarence Pritchard. That's rich, especially when you know I can't even investigate the case. What are you talking about? I'm talking about how you told Divide to take me off the case so you could take it on yourself. Why would I do that? So you could get the award. That's not true, Nelson said with a touch of outrage. I tried to hire Mr. Malloy to investigate, but he said I had to give you a chance first. So that's why we're here, to tell you I'm offering an award. O'Connor frowned. You are? Yes, he is, Frank said, because I thought you should have at least a chance. This may surprise you, but I'm not interested in taking over all the crime investigations of New York City. Oh, that's right, you're rich and you never need to work another day in your life. No, I don't. So I brought Mr. Ellsworth down here to do the right thing, and here you are accusing us of what exactly are you accusing of? Well, someone paid the chief enough money for his while to look the other way for this murder. Apparently, the chief doesn't care if the murderer gets caught or not. So during this time, Sarah has, if you've been reading these books, Sarah, like I said previously, Sarah was a midwife. And she was, she's not been delivering children as much as she used to because she's with Frank and in the house and doesn't have to support herself. But she misses it greatly. So Frank, and not the last book, but the book before that, Frank came up with this idea that they should build a house where women can come to need a place to stay while waiting for the child to be born, and then a place to stay while they figure out what they're going to do with their lives after the child has been born and during their recovery. So Sarah was thrilled for this idea that they had the money to do this, and they also took in a few donations from other people, but most of they used their own money. So then in the last book, Maeve was put in charge of the construction of the place, because Maeve is really good at that. She's very good at being an authority figure. And they've got the house done, and they've got the house open, and they've got women in it. And so Sarah goes to the house, and she goes to the house, and this girl answers the door that doesn't know who Sarah is. So when Sarah tells us that she's the lady that founded the house, she lets Sarah in, and then this other lady comes along that knows Sarah and tells Jocelyn, that's the girl's name, she goes, Duchess, go get us some tea. And Sarah doesn't like the fact that this other lady called her Duchess. And so Sarah asked this woman why she calls this woman Duchess. Apparently, her rich parents sent her to the home to have the baby and then give the baby up for adoption, whether she wants to or not, and then return home from a vacation. So Sarah and Jocelyn have a discussion, and it's explained that what happened with the father of the child, he lied and abused her a little bit. He wants nothing to do with the child. He doesn't believe it's his. Her parents don't want the stigma of an unwed mother in their household. It's against societal rules. So they sent her. So instead of sending her to Europe to have the baby and then have the baby stay there and her come back here, they sent her to this home. And so Sarah learns all her story from her. And while they're there, apparently the neighborhood noticed that Sarah was there, and they informed Mr. Blackjack Robinson, who we met in the previous book. He's going to become a slightly recurring character. He was a new a character introduced in a few books. He's like Sonny Corinthos. He's a mob guy with a heart, I guess. And he's very, very wealthy. And he also spies Jocelyn when he comes to take Mrs. Malloy home and have a little conversation with her, catch up with her. And that later on gives Sarah an idea. So they investigate the Clarence's murder, and in doing so, they find out that Mrs. Pritchard had a side piece, should I say, had a friend who everybody in the world knew about. They may not have known that they were bed partners, but and I would have. They didn't mention it in the books at all. It wasn't mentioned. It was not even implied. But I wouldn't be surprised if the kids in the book turned out to be the friend's kids and not the husband's kids. But he's deceased now, so it doesn't really matter. So they're trying to solve the murder of Clarence Pritchard. And they also find out some hinky things are going on with his milk company. And Mr. Pritchard prided himself on pure processed milk. Some other establishments in the city had not yet gotten to the pasteurization. And it was killing people. And it was killing the animals too, by the way. And I like to falsely imagine that all cows grow up on farms and have access to sun and warmth during the day and get to go out. I'd like to leave my imagination that way. So we'll do that. So Theda tells them that they've been told that Mr. Bergman is a tailor who rose through the ranks of the industry and has now owned several franchises. That's today's term. It later proves to be false. All the information that Theda knew about Uncle Otto turns out to be a little on the false side. So that while they're investigating Clarence Pritchard, they start investigating the dairy. They start investigating other dairies. One thing leads to another. Things get out of hand. Then what? Things get out of hand, and Harvey, the son, also gets murdered. And while this is going on, Sarah is playing matchmaker between Jocelyn and Robinson, and it's really, really cute. They end up having a really cute relationship. So you'll have to read the book to find out what's going on, how many people actually get murdered, and who is really doing the murder. Because several times the finger is, first they pointed at Harvey for doing his father, and then they pointed at Mrs. Pritchard, then they pointed at Otto. The finger gets pointed at all these different people. Then there's a little bit of mob involvement, and they need Mr. Robinson to help them out with that. Then they discover that someone has a secret identity in the book. I just love this series. I just love it to death. And I always make a point of reading. I love Victoria's little side note at the end. I hope you enjoyed reading this book as much as I enjoyed writing it. I'm indebted to my friend, author Susanna Calkins, who suggested the victim would be own a dairy. When I was brainstorming with a few of my authors, neither of us knew about the history of milk in New York City. So imagine how excited I was when I read about the milk wars, which happened a few years before the story and resulting in outlawing swill milk and saved countless young lives. Sarah is absolutely correct when she says that in the mid 1800s, half of the children in New York City died before the age of 5. Contaminated milk was a leading cause of those deaths, and other diseases claimed that was already weakened from the bad milk. Even after the milk laws were passed, some dairies still doctored swill milk for a period of time. We've come a long way in food purity since then. The checkered game of life was a real game invented by a young draftsman named Milton Bradley in 1860. Checkered referred to both the board and was patterned like a checkboard, and also to the checkered way life sometimes go. And then in the 1960s, it was redone. It's the game of life. Even I recognize that part. So I hope you will check this out and enjoy these people with me. I love Mrs. Ellsworth. I love Sarah and Frank and Maeve and Gino and Mr. and Mrs. Decker, who makes a very, very brief appearance in the book. And we also get a wedding. We have 2 weddings. We start the book with the wedding and we end the book with the wedding. To find out who the second wedding is, you gotta check it out. So have a good one.